I thought I had. Sorry, did you all miss all of
We,
that?
I think we did. I think we have. Sorry, Alexandra. I
Oh
think we
no!
have. Apologies.
And I'll put my camera back. Something happened maybe when you started recording. Anyway, sorry, I'll go again. Apologies. So yeah, thank you so much for your introduction, David. So yeah, as you said, and at LNG, I started looking at this about 5 years ago and was quite shocked with what I found. I've been monitoring on an annual basis since then. Picture hasn't really changed at all. And I've been on a complete journey with this, and I was very in the weeds on the data. But increasingly, I want to be looking broader picture and zoning out and having a think about what part this plays in the overall societal expectations when it comes to retirement, which I think are changing with the generations, and having a think about the roles of the different stakeholders. So whether that be the state, the employer, or the individual. So my pack is going to cover both the detail of the gender pensions gap, where we are, and where the UK is versus other countries, but also have a think about how we might go about changing this and what we're actually striving for. So I will attempt to share my slide, and please shout if this doesn't work.
We can see those. Well, I can certainly see them.
If I go into slide present, does that still
There
work?
we go. That's brilliant. Yep.
Yep. Fabulous. Okay, thank you. Here we go. So I'm going to start with a look at societal expectations around retirement, and then have a think about how much is enough for dignity in retirement, who is less on track, how does the gender pensions gap materialise, and then how can different stakeholders, so the state, the employer, and the individual, all play their part in helping secure financial dignity for all. And then, as you said, questions at the end. So taking a step back, I came across this quote recently. Harvard Business Review have just released a retirement toolkit, $80 for anybody that wants to get on top of planning for that phase of their life. And something that struck me about this quote was the fact that so often we think about retirement as a one-off point in time, when actually it's a large phase of somebody's life, and increasingly so as we all live longer, which is fantastic. The fact that it is deeply personal, so it's going to be very different for everybody. And the fact that it is not just about the money, it's about also those intangible assets you have. So the good health and the companionship you need to enjoy that phase of your life. So I think this is a really nice, succinct way of framing what we're all striving for when we think about retirement. So what do people expect from retirement? So a recent piece of research by the FSCS to those aged 18 to 65 asked the question about when people expect to retire. Close to half expected to retire after state pension age, never, or with no idea, which I guess we can take as probably not before state pension age. And when we think about how people are going to fund that retirement phase, 56% we're going to rely on state support, 51% on workplace support or savings, about 1 in 4 personal savings, and then 1 in 5 we're planning to work. So from this, I guess we're building a picture that it's a variation of different sources, not one that will all need to play their part. So then that got me thinking about how much you might need as a minimum. And I reached out to Professor Matt Padley at the University of Loughborough, and he's got his social research team, which have been doing this analysis for a number of years now. And they've got this idea of a minimum income standard. So they hold a number of focus groups up and down the land where they ask people the simple question about how much as a minimum you might need. And they focus on different household types. One of those is retirement. And they also get expert input, but it's really people on the ground, as it were, from different backgrounds to have a lively debate about what they might need. And they then, once they've got that list, go out and price up how much that might cost. So they've just done the latest iteration of that, went live September 2024. So they estimate that to meet that income standard, you need a total of £257 per week as a single pensioner. And you can see the list of underlying components. And as I touched on with the Harvard Business Review, you can see the second most expensive component, as it were, the social and cultural activities. it's really important that in retirement people can still actively participate in society, whether that go to the local bingo hall or go on a holiday once a year. That's really, really important. And then in here you've got council tax, but actually that doesn't take into account any other housing costs. So I think we've all heard about the numbers that increasingly having to rent, and renting till later in life, if not forever. So here are some latest figures from the English Housing Survey looking at social and private renting costs in the UK, split by different regions. And so here I'm saying expected rental costs of 196 per week, taking the all England. So that gives a rough overall cost or expenditure of £450 per week as a sort of baseline. And I think that's important to bear in mind when we're thinking a bit more about who's on track or not. So zoning out a bit, left-hand side here, the 3 bars are the living pension. So building on that 450, but turning it into an annual amount. So here's the £450 per week if you don't have additional rental costs. This with the social rent and this with the private rent. And you can see a steady step up in terms of how much you need. And this is post-tax. So this is how much you need on an annual basis. And then on the right-hand side, you might have heard of the PLSA retirement living standards. So again, quite well-developed industry benchmarks, having a think about what you might need in retirement. But the PLSA is far more focused on retirement aspirations, so living standards, and don't currently take into account housing costs. So for the PLSA, you'd need to add on rental costs to take aspirations and housing costs into account. But you see, for a comfortable standard of living, you're looking at £43,000 per year. And that's an overall. And obviously, you've got a state pension. So the grey bar is just showing current state pension relative to those benchmarks. So are we currently saving enough? So the previous slide was looking at the annual amount you might need. And then here I've translated that into a pot of money from your workplace pension that when you add it to your state pension would get you to those various standards. So you can see for comfortable retirement, estimated pot that you would need at a retirement age of 67 is about £770,000. And then it's obviously less for these minimum levels and a variation in between. So then if I overlay that with Office of National Statistics data, this is showing pension savings, current pension savings of 50-plus-year-olds in the UK. You can see that not very many are on track for meeting the amount that you might be required to meet those various standards. And actually, I was quite shocked when I looked at this data to find that pensions wealth is more unequal than overall wealth. I didn't expect to see that. So you've got the top decile, so this is the top 10% by pensions wealth, holding 64% of the overall wealth, and the bottom 50% having less than 1% of the overall pensions wealth. And actually your bottom 30% of the population by pensions wealth are totally reliant on state support with no workplace pension savings. And then if we have a think about who might be more impacted when it comes to pension savings, and again, Office of National Statistics data, having a look at the various intersections in society. Starting left-hand side, we start to have a think about the gender pensions gap. So here, ONS data shows that women have 2/3 of the pension savings of men based on their latest wealth and assets survey. But actually, as this footnote, this data excludes zeros. So actually, when we think about the number of women that aren't saving into a workplace pension, we know that that difference would be far more accentuated than is shown in this picture. And then household type is a big one. So if you're a single parent with dependent children, you're saving less than if you're a couple with non-dependent children. That sort of makes sense. Self-employed versus employed. So in the UK, prior to the pandemic, we had about 5 million people working self-employed. That dropped back over the course of the pandemic, but is a sizable chunk of the workforce. So when we think about initiatives, focus areas, self-employed is definitely one that we need to do something about. Disability, not very well researched, but again, the ONS data shows that those with long-standing illnesses or disabilities have less pension savings than those without. And then the final intersection here shown is ethnicity and the impact that has on pension savings. And actually L&G did a bit of research about 2 years ago, focused on this, with quite startling figures, focused on white British versus other ethnic groups, and the lack of pension savings. They may well be saving into other forms, but in terms of workplace pensions, they had significantly less than their white British counterparts. So then zooming out, so current levels of poverty in retirement. So this is data from the households below average income, focused on the retiree population. We see that 15% of the current roughly 12 million retirees are deemed as living in relative poverty. So that's with an income of less than 60% of the median income. And then 8% of those are, so 8% of that 12 million population are living in what's deemed material deprivation. So this is, they're asked a series of questions. So the likes of, do you have a warm waterproof winter coat? Do you have one warm filling meal a day? And do you go on one holiday away from home a year? And there's a whole, I think there's 15 questions in total that they answer, which leads to the over 8%. So that's roughly 2 million current retirees living in relative poverty, and a subsection of those in material deprivation. And when we have a think about how that picture might change going forward, this is Independent Age research, the charity Independent Age, estimate that that is due to double over the next couple of decades, so rising to about 4 million pensioners living in relative poverty. So the trajectory isn't good. And there are some risk factors when it comes to retirement savings. So women, so currently 19% of women are in relative poverty in retirement versus 16% of men. If you're single, life's more expensive than if you're in a couple. So again, the figures are higher for those that are living by themselves. And actually by living longer, most women, or lots of women, will at some stage be living by themselves, not in a couple. What do we have next? Renting. So touched on this already. Renting is a huge issue, growing the numbers of people that are renting and will be in retirement and the costs that that entails through retirement. And then financial resilience. And there's lots of stats about the lack of financial resilience, and the likes of Nest Insight and others do great research on this, having a think about or actually saying that we need to build up people's financial resilience during working life before people then can think about saving for retirement, and better linking those two is something we definitely want to look at in more detail. A zoom out, so I looked at broader societal inequalities. So here from the Wealth and Assets Survey, we've got much loved deciles by wealth, and this is actually, so we focused on income deciles. So the bottom 10% by income, left-hand side, and the top 10% by income, right-hand side. So you can see, as you might expect, a steady step up as you go through those deciles. But that is dwarfed by the wealth differences by those deciles. So the wealth inequality is far more than the income inequality, which you might expect because wealth is cumulative, income is an ongoing basis. But I think there's general rhetoric now that wealth, maybe inequality has increased to a level where it's unsustainable and we need to do something about it. There's lots of data on wealth, but this is quite an interesting one that I found. So Lorenz curve, which is a bit geeky, but here we're looking at cumulative wealth and cumulative proportion of households. So if you're on the diagonal, then you are a perfectly equal society. And the further away you are from that diagonal, the more unequal. And we can look at the subcomponents of wealth here. And starting with physical. So physical wealth, this is the stuff we all have. So cars, antiques, other stuff around the house. So that's least unequal when it comes to wealth between the deciles. Followed by property. This is net property wealth, so also taking into account outstanding mortgages people have. Followed by private pension, and then finally by financial. And here, again, quite startling, I found the fact that you have to get to 60% of households before you get net positive financial wealth. I didn't realise that it was such a shocking picture. So really, private pension and financial wealth, we really need to be thinking more about how we enable that curve to ping more back towards the diagonal in years to come. So my key chart from LNG, so this is the latest data I have, December 2023, 5 million members. And when I plot pension savings, and this is defined contribution savings, when I plot that by gender and by age, you can see in blue men's pension savings dwarfing women's. So even at the very start, we have a 21% pensions gap, that mostly driven by gender pay gap. And that just increases over a lifetime. So on average, it's 39% difference, but really starts to escalate from about 30 onwards, reaching that final figure currently, women retiring with less than half of their male peers' pension savings. Why is that an issue? Well, it means that women are far more likely to face poverty in retirement than men. And so current retiree pots for our defined contribution business, men have 26,000 and women have 12,000. I mean, the bigger thing is that neither of those amounts is enough to sustain you in retirement, but 12,000 definitely isn't. With less money, there's less opportunity, less choice. So we find that most women will be cashing out their pots because it doesn't make sense for them to buy an annuity or to stay invested. So they lose out on that longevity protection from an annuity, and they also lose out on that future investment growth from staying invested and going into income drawdown. And then on top of this, we have women living typically 4 years more than men. So they actually need more at the point of retirement to sustain them for those additional years. And when we have a look at care and the retirees that are currently in care, the average age of somebody in care is 86. And double the number of women in care than men, just again by the fact that we typically live longer, and so need that care for a bit longer. So again, when we have a think about how much somebody might need, all of these factors we need to take into account. So I focused on DC because that's our bread and butter, where I focus at LNG. But the government came out with a report June 2023 that looked at the gender pensions gap between DB and DC. So this is a chart from that report. So you can see there's a gender pensions gap for DB as well as for DC. It's larger for DC, so 60% versus the 44% for DB. And there's also that bigger picture around pensions adequacy. And you can see that the median pensions wealth is far greater for DB than DC. So there's a pension adequacy issue for DC, but also the pensions equity. And the real losers here are female DC pension savers. When we have a look at and ask the question about how likely that picture is to change in the future, so from the same government report here, we're now looking at median annual pension savings, so contributions flowing in. Here they cut the data slightly differently, so they focused on public sector and private sector, but 90% of public sector are DB and 90% of private sector are DC. So they're sort of exchangeable, and you can look at the annual pension savings. So again, female private sector, aka DC, has median pension savings of 1,500 versus a male public sector / DB 8,500. So a roughly 6 times difference, which I think shows, illustrates that we're probably not going to change this picture anytime soon unless we do something about it. How do we compare to other countries? So OECD data here, looking at the gender pensions gap in 2000 on the x-axis at the bottom and y-axis in 2016, and looking at whether the picture had changed. So anything below the diagonal is an improvement. Where are we? So we are right at the top. So we have improved over that period, but we are still top right with one of the largest gender pensions gaps of all the OECD countries. Not a great place to be. So who does this well? So the Nordic countries do. So this is a really interesting piece of research that the Nordic Council of Ministers came out with recently, looking at the gender pensions gap across the Nordic countries. And ringed in red is Iceland. So they are the winners when it comes to the lowest gender pensions gap. So they've got a gender pensions gap of about 5%. Why is that? So it is largely to do with the fact that they don't attribute all pension savings to or link them to earnings. Really interesting. And here I'll give you a bit of Icelandic inspiration in a bit more detail. So here is from a paper I could find looking at the Icelandic system. So along the x-axis, you've got workplace pension savings. So right-hand side, you've got somebody with really healthy workplace pension savings in dark blue. And then on the y-axis, you've got total pension. So looking across workplace pension and state pension. So everybody gets a minimum state pension, regardless of workplace savings. So it's set at 15% of median income. And then there are a range of state supplements to top everybody up to what they deem to be a minimal socially acceptable level, which they've set at 45% of median income. So they've got a means tested supplement, and they've got a household supplement. So if you're single, living by yourself, you get additional support. And then this minimum subsistence guarantee for somebody who really doesn't have any workplace pension savings at all. So quite an interesting and slightly different take on overall pension savings and retirement, with the repercussions of the result that they have a very low gender pensions gap, 5%. You might say with all that state support, nobody works, but actually the reverse is true. So this is OECD data looking at employment rates in Iceland, and most notably at the younger and the older ages. So this is looking at Icelandic employment rates versus UK. So 81% of those in the category 55 to 64 are employed versus 65% in the UK. And Iceland actually at these younger and older ages have the highest employment rate of all OECD countries. So not saying that we could take this and just apply it in the UK, but I think it is quite helpful to look abroad and have a think about how others are doing it and whether we can take any lessons and have a think about how we integrate those moving forward. So the top reasons behind the gender pensions gap. So the first one being lower salaries, so the gender pay gap, well documented. ONS has started collecting data on this from 1997. And you can see over time it has been falling, which is fantastic. But when you look at the older ages, it hasn't been falling as quickly as the younger ages. So you can see in this chart, 30 to 39-year-olds, between 2012 and 2017, there was hardly any gender pay gap. It's crept up slightly since then. But the 40 to 49-year-olds is still at higher than 10% gender pay gap. So we definitely need to make more progress when it comes to 40 plus. Another reason, so career breaks. So when we have a think about the initial career breaks in a typical family setup, a woman would take a step back in order to raise a family. Some of the policies you might be able to put in place, one of these is shared parental leave. When this was set out and made live by the government, they had a target of 25% take up in terms of eligible fathers. Since it's been live, the take up has been far lower. So I don't think it's been a huge success. So that would need some thinking, whether we can change that. Two of the main pitfalls when it comes to shared parental leave is the fact that it's shared. So the primary caregiver partner needs to give up typically some of her leave in order to enable the secondary partner to take some of it. And then the other one is that the pay you get when you're on shared parental leave is pretty low. So when we think about the household finances, it doesn't make financial sense for lots of households for the man, typically, based on the last slide, who's earning more, to take this up. And then when we have a think of longer term, working patterns, and we have a think about who's working part-time, which is a large factor in the gender pensions gap. So this is looking at the last 30 years and women in yellow. So actually the proportion of women working part-time has fallen. So fallen from about 40% to 32%, 32%. Over that period, and actually the proportion of men working part-time over that period has increased. There was 5% and is now at 10%. So having a think about part-timers and how they are saving into a pension and incentivized to do so is another area I think that we should be focusing on having a think about fixing the gender pensions gap. Divorce. So divorce is a really big one. And requires a bit of research to have a look at the data around divorce, and the number of people that take pensions wealth into account when they're going through divorce is pretty limited. But this is a really interesting chart I found from some work that Deborah Price had done at the University of Manchester. So quite a complicated chart, but let me chat you through it by using examples. So here we're looking at combined pensions wealth split into quintiles across the population. So here is the lowest 20% in terms of pensions wealth. And this is looking at the portion of couples where, so this is, sorry, so lowest pensions wealth quintile. So this is saying 70% of, for 70% of couples, one of those partners in the couples holds 90 to 100% of the overall pensions wealth. So it's illustrating the unevenness of that pensions wealth when you're having a think about a partnership or a household level and who it sits with. And that falls away slightly. So the highest quintile, you've got just over 40% of couples where one of those partners holds 90 to 100% of the pensions wealth. So it's lower, but it's still a significant proportion. And when we have a look at how many divorces are estimated to include a pension sharing order, the proper calcs are done to value a pension, that's estimated at only 5 to 6% of divorces. And we come to the 4 C's. So complexity, cost, culture, and conflict are driving that low level of estimation of pensions wealth when it comes to divorce. Another big one, childcare costs. So here I've got the UK population distributed by net household income. And so here we've got a median income, the UK, £545 per week. And then when I look at the cost of nursery currently for full-time, this is 2 preschool children, full-time, so from 9 to 5 every day, 5 days a week, it comes in at £596 per week. And then when I look at nursery in London, full-time for those 2 preschool children is £859 per week. So it's clear that the sums don't work. And in many households, there just isn't a choice about whether both work on an ongoing basis once you've had children. But that has broader societal implications. So here, plotting the fall in fertility rates in the UK against an OECD average, and Korea, who have the lowest and have done for the last 20 years. So UK at 1.56, and actually the latest results show for England and Wales that this has fallen again to 1.4, which is the lowest ever since history began. So this is really becoming quite critical because you need a replacement ratio of 2.1 in order to sustain a population. That's without net migration, which we do have a healthy amount of in the UK. So when I have a look at a chart of population growth in the UK and how that's projected to change over the next 50 years, so this is OECD data, OBR, you can see in green that most of our future population growth is going to be due to net immigration. And actually this year, for the first time, we recorded more deaths than births for the first time, which is quite a step change. Why is this an issue? So I found this interesting chart in a recent OBR report looking at projected total government revenue and spending over the next 50 years. So revenue in yellow, fairly static, and then slightly declining. that as a result of that aging demographic and shrinking working age population. And then total government spending, crikey, in green, steadily increasing quite quickly off the chart. And after paying interest on our debt, the largest drivers of this are increased spend on state pensions, adult social care, and another one that I can't remember, but one associated with the fact that we've got an aging population that will come to me in a minute. So this is becoming quite a big issue that we need to tackle more holistically. And this is another interesting chart that I'll just flash up. So this is looking at receipts and spending by age. So showing that during those key working ages, in blue, the tax revenue that the government gets as a result of you paying your taxes while you're at. And then as you age, the tax revenue reducing, and the spending that the state needs to do increasing. So the main components of health, welfare, and other spending increasing. So a tick up in the average age of your population has huge ramifications for that balance between receipts and spending. And when we focus on the state pension, so here, I think my last interesting chart, this is showing the balance of the National Insurance Fund. So this is where national insurance contributions go in, and then state pensions are paid out of. And there's a small amount that's ring-fenced and taken off to fund for the NHS, but the main flows in national insurance and the main flows out of state pensions. And you can see that the balance of this fund is peaking in 2035, and then is falling quite dramatically, reaching a balance of zero in 2040 or soon after. And that doesn't mean there's no money, because it's the balance, but it does raise a question about the future sustainability of the state pension in its current form. And this report, the government's actuaries report, estimates that national insurance contributions, the combined stage one, employee and employer would need to rise from 22% to 34% to make this work out to 2085. So just giving you an idea of the numbers. So what have I covered? What do people have? So I think there's general uncertainty about future provision of state support. People are increasingly, at least in the private sector, relying on a pot of cash and what they do with that, and they've got inadequate support as it stands. What do they need? So some security on state benefits, a security when it comes to workplace pensions to top that up to a certain level of lifestyle aspiration or meeting minimum income standard. And then the support is critical for this future generations looking to retire in years to come. So quickly, what can be done? So how could the state best support in the future? Could they pay more? I think I've illustrated that's probably not the answer. It's not feasible. Pay less? Well, actually, our current state pension is not that generous. So the PPI worked it out to give roughly 22% replacement ratio to median income. Pay for less time, so not really an option above a certain amount, raising it to a certain age because of this longevity inequality we've got. So I estimated that if you were to raise the state pension age to 70, a third of the poorest wouldn't make it at all because of life longevity expectations. So this seems to be the only idea that might work, is to look at targeting support. So I take you back to the Icelandic picture. I'm going to just do an exercise here. So we've got the minimum income standard excluding rent. Here we've got current net income for retirees in the UK, again by disposable income decile, so richest right-hand side, poorest left-hand side. We've got some state benefits, including something like disability allowance, PIP, carers allowance and others. Current state pension. I'm going to scrub that. I'm going to have a new base state pension of 15% of median income. Pension supplement, means tested. And then I'm going to have my MIS guarantee, minimum income standard guarantee, to get everybody up to that level. And then I'm going to have to think about who is renting and what type of renting they are needing to do, whether that be social or private, to give people that top up to meet the minimum income standard, including rent. Another answer we could do is that we could all work for longer. So this is thinking about the individual and how they could play it. So reading an interesting book at the moment, 100 Year Life, which looks at and writes a lot about the fact that we are partway through a transition. We did traditionally have 3 phases, so the full-time education, work and retirement. And actually moving forward, if we are all living to 100, work is going to be broken down into various phases because it's going to be far more of a significant chunk of our overall life. So they deem kind of different phases. So explorer phase is when you're just starting work, getting out in the world, finding how it works and how you might best fit in. Independent producer is where you're making, building, creating something and you're independently sustained. And then at the end of your career, the idea of a portfolio of different jobs. So you do need some money still, and you want to stay connected to society. That's important for your own vitality. You also increasingly want to be looking to provide something back to society. So that social purpose becomes more important, perhaps. But as I've covered fleetingly already, the longevity inequalities we've currently got mean that isn't going to be the answer for everybody. So current longevity in the UK between the least deprived and most deprived, we've got a difference of about 8 to 9 years in life expectancy. When you have a look at how that's set to change over the coming years, or how that has changed over the last decade, between the least and most deprived, it's actually going backwards, that gap, and increasing. So the gap between the least and most deprived is increasing, or has increased by about 7 months over that period. So that doesn't look like it's changing anytime soon. Can we all save more? So back to my households below average income. This focused on working age population. So using the same metric of relative poverty, we find 20%, so that's higher than the levels, the retiree community, 20% of the working age population are living in what's deemed relative poverty, with 6% in deemed as materially deprived. Resolution Foundation estimate that there are 11.2 million working age individuals living in households that have less than £1,000 of savings. So again, this can we all save more is not going to be an answer for everybody. And there's a whole host of other challenges people might face. Talked about falling fertility rates, increased longevity, renting, home ownership, keeping up with the Joneses, so lifestyles, the levels of debt, so student loan debt and mortgages, starting them later and having them later into retirement, and then the overall economic stagnation, lack of growth, and the impact of that on everybody. We're going to have quickly a thought to workplace pensions. So we did some research, this was the ethnic research actually, working with Humankind Research, having a look at what people were struggling with and the main barriers. So we talked a lot about the lack of affordability, structural barriers, but there are also some attitudinal barriers. So the 3 main ones being lack of knowledge, lack of trust, and lack of relevance. In order to address those attitudinal barriers, 3 opportunity areas. So how you communicate. So having to think about the amount of jargon we all use. I want to definitely use lots of that. Having more relevant messengers and platforms. So I think we've seen that already in the pension provider world with the likes of kind of increasing presence on the TikTok platforms, TikTok videos, and others, Instagram accounts and all of that. And there was another one that slipped my mind. What you communicate is really important. So people want simple case studies. So A versus B, what does it mean for them? Assurances. People want to be assured about what happens if I die, what happens if the economy crashes, what happens if my employer goes bankrupt. So covering all of that and assuring people. And then the investment side, really simple information, bringing to life where their pension savings are invested. It's really important. And then the final one, the products you offer, which I get excited about because this, I think, is where increasing amounts of energy are being spent to have a think about how we might offer more breadth of products, so tailored more to people's lives. So whether that be you're working part-time, you have a range of different jobs, you can't afford the auto-enrollment contributions, but you don't want to opt out. And then having to think about that security of income in retirement, and the fact that for those that have DC pension, being given a pot of cash at retirement and being told good luck, really. Well, not as blunt as that, but people having to work out for themselves how to manage that on an ongoing basis as they age is not really going to be possible for many. So having a think about how we provide security in the income in retirement is where a huge amount of energy is increasingly being focused. I'm part of the Pension Secretary group that was mentioned at the start, and we've just brought out this best practice guide for employers, which is available on our LinkedIn group, but happy to send that round after this session. And it just takes through an employer through what they might want to think about getting a handle on their own scheme analysis, where they stand, who's on track and who's not, and how to do something about that. Questions? I'll stop sharing.
Great, Alexandra, thank you very much. And that was really comprehensive and